What happens when the weight of a crown becomes too much to bear? Behind Britain's monarchy lived rulers who reached their breaking points. Tonight, we explore 24 royals who snapped under pressure, their composure cracking under impossible demands. From breakdowns that changed dynasties to decisions that shocked kingdoms, these stories reveal how even the strongest fractured under unbearable weight. Before we witness these moments, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because these breaking points remind us that crowns cannot shield against human limits. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. Number 1. Queen Mary I, the daughter who became Bloody Mary. What drives a woman to order hundreds of executions in just 5 years? Queen Mary I, who ruled England from 1553 to 1558, broke under decades of psychological pressure that transformed her from a devout princess into the monarch history remembers as Bloody Mary. Born in 1516 as Henry VIII's cherished daughter, Mary watched her world collapse when her father cast aside her mother, declared her illegitimate, and forced her to serve her infant half-sister as a mere lady-in-waiting. These humiliations festered for years, building pressure that would eventually manifest in religious persecution that shocked even her supporters. Historical sources document Mary's deteriorating state as she waited decades to claim a throne she believed was stolen from her. Contemporary accounts describe someone consumed by twin obsessions, restoring her legitimacy and returning England to Catholicism. When she finally became queen at age 37, these fixations merged into a conviction that Protestant resistance wasn't political opposition, but personal betrayal, deserving the harshest punishment. The religious prosecutions that defined her reign reflected a woman who had broken under accumulated trauma. Mary's policies led to nearly 300 executions for heresy in just 5 years, a pace of religious prosecution that contemporary observers found shocking. Sources suggest she viewed each execution not as political necessity, but as righteous response to years of suffering. Her phantom pregnancy, which she desperately believed was real despite all evidence, revealed how completely pressure had affected her judgment, her need for validation overwhelming rational thought. She died in November 1558 at age 42, having achieved her goal of restoring Catholic worship, but leaving a legacy defined primarily by the prosecutions her breakdown had driven, demonstrating how decades of psychological pressure can transform even the most devout into figures history struggles to comprehend. Number 2. Margaret of Anjou, the queen who became a warrior. What happens when a foreign queen must save a kingdom her husband can no longer defend? Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort of England from 1445 to 1471, snapped under the impossible pressure of watching her husband King Henry VI descend into mental collapse while enemies circled their throne. Born in 1430 as a French princess, Margaret arrived in England expecting a conventional queenly role, but when Henry suffered his first complete mental breakdown in 1453, the carefully constructed facade of her life shattered, forcing a transformation that shocked medieval England. Contemporary chronicles describe Margaret's metamorphosis from diplomatic consort to military commander with a mixture of horror and fascination. When Henry became catatonic, unable to recognize people or make decisions, Margaret broke every rule governing queenly behavior by personally commanding armies, directing military strategy, and making battlefield decisions that male nobles considered their exclusive domain. Sources suggest this wasn't gradual evolution, but sudden rupture. A woman snapping under pressure and deciding that if men wouldn't save her family, she would do it herself, regardless of propriety or precedent. Her conduct during the Wars of the Roses revealed how completely she had fractured under strain. Historical records document Margaret personally ordering executions after battles, directing troops with ruthlessness that appalled contemporaries, and showing no mercy to enemies she believed threatened her son's inheritance. After the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where her forces were crushed and her only child was killed, sources describe a woman completely broken, the fierce warrior queen reduced to a captive whose spirit had finally shattered under years of impossible pressure. Margaret died in 1482 in France, having spent her final years in poverty and obscurity, the fire that had driven her military campaigns extinguished by losses too great to bear, demonstrating how pressure can transform anyone into something unrecognizable before ultimately breaking them completely. Number 3. Princess Margaret, the modern royal who couldn't breathe. What happens when a free spirit is trapped in a gilded cage? Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, spent her life from 1930 to 2002 under the weight of being royal enough to face constant scrutiny, but not important enough to have clear purpose. Born into privilege that became her prison, Margaret struggled repeatedly under pressure that combined family duty, lost love, and the realization that her existence was defined by being someone else's sister, someone else's concern. The breaking point that defined her life came in 1955 when she was forbidden to marry Peter Townsend, the divorced man she genuinely loved. Contemporary accounts describe Margaret's anguish as she chose duty over happiness, but sources suggest this sacrifice affected something fundamental in her outlook. What followed wasn't graceful acceptance, but visible rebellion expressed through affairs, lifestyle choices that concerned family, and public behavior that created difficulties for the monarchy she'd sacrificed to protect. Biographers examining her life note that each subsequent relationship seemed troubled, each public incident revealing ongoing struggle with the choice she'd been forced to make. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones began with hope, but descended into mutual difficulties that revealed how damaged Margaret had become. They would clash verbally, conduct affairs, and create an atmosphere that friends described as genuinely uncomfortable. When the marriage ended in divorce in 1978, it represented the collapse of a relationship built on a woman already affected by institutional pressure. Margaret's final decades saw her health deteriorate alongside her spirit, with medical issues reducing her mobility while bitterness coloured what remained. She died in 2002, having struggled to find happiness or purpose, her entire life marked by pressure that the modern world witnessed but couldn't prevent, demonstrating how even privilege cannot protect against the weight of impossible expectations. Number 4. King Henry VIII, the slow descent into paranoia. King Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547, didn't break suddenly, but rather underwent a gradual psychological transformation that contemporary observers documented with growing alarm. Born in 1491 as a charismatic prince, Henry began his reign as the Golden King of European courts, but a jousting accident in 1536 marked the beginning of a personality change that would define his final decade and cost numerous lives. Historical records suggest the head injury Henry sustained during that tournament, combined with chronic pain from leg ulcers that never healed, contributed to dramatic shifts in his temperament. Contemporary accounts describe a king whose moods became increasingly unpredictable, whose suspicions grew more elaborate, and whose capacity for trust seemed to evaporate. Sources indicate that courtiers who had once approached Henry confidently began doing so with visible apprehension, uncertain whether they would face the charming king or the changed man he was becoming. His treatment of those closest to him revealed how completely pressure and pain had altered his thinking. Anne Boleyn, whom he had broken with Rome to marry, was executed on charges historians generally consider questionable. Thomas Cromwell, who had served loyally for years, was arrested and killed. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was executed along with alleged companions. The pattern reflected what sources suggest was genuine conviction that those around him posed threats, a belief that may have stemmed from psychological effects of his injuries and declining health. His final years saw Henry become isolated by his own suspicions, surrounded by people who feared him rather than advised him honestly. He died in January 1547 at age 55, having transformed from Renaissance prince to suspicious ruler. demonstrating how physical trauma combined with pressures of absolute power can gradually erode even the most confident personality. Number 5. King Edward II, the king who loved unwisely. King Edward II, who ruled England from 1307 to 1327, broke under pressures he refused to acknowledge, his emotional fixations blinding him to political realities until the monarchy itself collapsed around him. Born in 1284 as the son of Edward I, he inherited a kingdom his father had controlled through military might. But Edward lacked both his father's abilities and his willingness to prioritize duty over personal attachments. Contemporary chronicles document Edward's intense attachments to certain favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, that went beyond normal royal favouritism into territory that alarmed his nobles. Historical sources suggest Edward's emotional dependency on these men affected his judgment so profoundly that he couldn't recognise how his choices were destroying his political position. When nobles demanded Gaveston's exile, Edward's inability to accept this pressure led to conflicts that resulted in Gaveston's death by rebellious barons in 1312. Rather than learning from this tragedy, Edward's attachment to Hugh Despenser years later followed the same pattern. Sources indicate he elevated Despenser to positions that angered nobles and allowed his emotional needs to override political wisdom. Contemporary accounts describe a king so focused on protecting his favourite that he couldn't see his kingdom unravelling, pressure building around him that he was unable to address. His wife Isabella's rebellion in 1326 represented the final collapse. When she invaded with Roger Mortimer, Edward's support evaporated as nobles abandoned a king whose emotional fixations had made effective governance impossible. He was forced to abdicate, imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, and died in September 1327 under circumstances historians debate. His reign demonstrates how emotional dependency can become a form of breaking under pressure. The inability to prioritize duty over personal attachment, ultimately destroying everything. Number 6. King Charles I, the king who couldn't bend. King Charles I, who ruled England, Scotland and Ireland from 1625 until his execution in 1649, broke under pressure by refusing to bend at all. His absolute conviction in his divine right, creating a rigidity that turned political crisis into civil war. Born in 1600 as the second son who never expected to rule, Charles developed an unwavering belief in royal authority that left him psychologically unable to compromise even when his throne and life depended on flexibility. Contemporary accounts describe Charles's fundamental inability to recognize that circumstances required adaptation. When Parliament attempted to limit his powers, sources suggest he interpreted these not as political negotiations, but as personal attacks on divinely ordained authority. His dissolution of Parliament multiple times reflected psychological inability to function within a system demanding compromise. Each dissolution demonstrating how pressure to share power created paralysis in his capacity to govern effectively. His management of religious tensions in Scotland revealed similar patterns. Rather than negotiating with Scottish Presbyterians who objected to his religious policies, Charles insisted rigidly on obedience, triggering the bishops' wars that drained his treasury and weakened his position. Historical records suggest he genuinely couldn't understand why his subjects wouldn't accept his authority, this incomprehension reflecting a point where psychological conviction overwhelmed practical sense. The civil war that began in 1642 represented Charles's complete failure to bend under mounting pressure. Even during the war, when opportunities for settlement arose, sources indicate Charles's inability to genuinely compromise sabotaged peace efforts. His trial and execution in January 1649 followed years of refusal to accept political reality, demonstrating how breaking can manifest not as explosion, but as fatal rigidity. The inability to adapt ultimately costing him his throne and his life. Number 7. King George III, when the king lost his mind. King George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1820, experienced multiple episodes of severe disturbance that contemporary observers described with a mixture of concern and pity, his public difficulties representing perhaps the most visible royal breakdown in British history. Born in 1738, George began his reign as a competent monarch, but starting in 1788, he suffered recurring episodes where his behaviour became so altered that those around him barely recognised the man they had known. Historical accounts from courtiers and physicians document disturbing changes during these episodes. George would speak rapidly for hours, his conversations jumping between topics without connection. Contemporary sources describe him addressing people who weren't present and exhibiting behaviour so disconnected that his family and ministers struggled to maintain the appearance of normal governance. Medical historians examining these accounts have proposed various explanations, though definitive diagnosis remains impossible given historical distance. The political consequences were severe. During his first major episode in 1788 to 1789, Parliament debated establishing a regency while physicians attempted treatments. Sources suggest the uncertainty about whether the king would recover created governmental difficulties as officials hesitated to make decisions without clear authority. When George did recover from this episode, the relief was temporary. Everyone now knew such episodes could recur. His final descent began around 1810. By 1811, George's condition had deteriorated so completely that his son was appointed Prince Regent. The king spent his final 9 years in seclusion at Windsor Castle, experiencing sensory decline and largely disconnected from reality. He died in 1820 at age 81, having spent a decade as a figure whose mind had deteriorated under pressures that remain incompletely understood, demonstrating how even dedicated monarchs cannot always withstand the strains of their position. Number 8. King John, the paranoid king who lost everything. King John, who ruled England from 1199 to 1216, broke under pressure by becoming increasingly suspicious until his behaviour alienated everyone whose support he needed to survive. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II, John grew up in a family where trust was scarce and betrayal common. Experiences that apparently shaped a personality prone to paranoia that would intensify under the pressures of kingship. Contemporary chronicles document John's growing suspicion of everyone around him. Medieval sources describe a king who saw disloyalty everywhere, whose responses to perceived threats became increasingly harsh and unpredictable. Historical records suggest that John's treatment of those who opposed him revealed how pressure had affected his judgment, his decisions shocking even medieval nobles accustomed to harsh authority. The loss of Normandy to France in 1204 intensified John's already difficult temperament. Chroniclers noted that the king became more suspicious and prone to extreme reactions, perceiving betrayal in every setback and responding with measures that further alienated the nobility. Sources suggest his inability to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones created a spiral where his harsh responses generated actual opposition, confirming his worldview and triggering even harsher reactions. His barons' eventual rebellion and the forced signing of Magna Carta in 1215 represented the complete failure of John's approach to governance. When he attempted to void the charter immediately after signing, civil war erupted. He died in October 1216 at age 49 during this conflict, having transformed initial advantages into total political collapse through behaviour that sources suggest reflected genuine deterioration rather than merely poor political judgment, demonstrating how paranoia under pressure can become self-fulfilling prophecy that destroys even those born to power. Number 9. King Richard II, the poet king who became a tyrant. King Richard II, who ruled England from 1377 to 1399, underwent one of history's most dramatic personality transformations, breaking under accumulated pressures and suddenly shifting from idealistic young king to vengeful autocrat in ways that shocked contemporaries. Born in 1367, Richard inherited the throne as a child and spent his early reign with surprising skill. But accumulated traumas apparently created pressures that would eventually produce a catastrophic change in his personality. Contemporary chronicles document Richard's early years as marked by artistic sensibility and attempts at sophisticated governance. He patronized poets and appeared more interested in cultural refinement than military conquest. Historical sources suggest that the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which Richard faced at age 14, left lasting marks. The sight of rebels storming the tower apparently created anxieties about security that would fester. The breaking point came in 1387 when nobles known as the Lords Appellant effectively seized control of his government. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard was forced to watch as his favourites were executed or exiled, powerless to prevent their destruction. Sources suggest this experience broke something fundamental. For several years, he appeared to accept his diminished role, but historians believe he was planning revenge while maintaining a facade of compliance. When Richard finally moved against the Lords Appellant in 1397, the transformation was shocking. He arrested former opponents, executed some, and confiscated estates with vindictiveness that observers found disturbing. His demand for blank charters that subjects had to sign revealed how completely he had shifted from idealistic youth to suspicious autocrat. This sudden turn triggered the rebellion that deposed him in 1399, leading to his death in captivity in 1400, demonstrating how pressure can remain hidden for years before producing explosive change. Number 10. King Henry VI, the king who retreated into silence. King Henry VI, who ruled England from 1422 to 1461, and briefly again in 1470 to 1471, broke under pressure by essentially withdrawing from reality itself, his psychological difficulties so complete that the kingdom fractured around his inability to function. Born in 1421, Henry inherited the throne as an infant and grew into a deeply pious man, utterly unsuited for the political environment of 15th century England. Contemporary accounts describe Henry as someone who preferred prayer and scholarship to governance, avoiding the confrontations that kingship required. Sources suggest this wasn't merely preference, but psychological inability to handle conflict, his personality so conflict-averse that pressure to make difficult choices seemed to paralyze him. Historical records show that even before his complete breakdown, Henry's tendency was to retreat from problems rather than address them, creating power vacuums that ambitious nobles filled. His first complete mental collapse in 1453 shocked the kingdom. Contemporary chroniclers describe Henry becoming completely unresponsive, unable to recognize people, including his own wife and newborn son, remaining largely silent and motionless for over a year. Medical historians examining these accounts have proposed various explanations, but what's clear is that the pressures of kingship combined with his unsuitable temperament produced a withdrawal so total that he essentially ceased to function. When he recovered in 1454, the political damage was irreversible. The Wars of the Roses that followed demonstrated how one person's psychological difficulties could destabilize an entire nation. Henry spent his final years as a puppet king, occasionally restored to the throne by one faction, but never truly governing. He was killed in the Tower of London in May 1471, having spent much of his adult life in states ranging from ineffective to completely disconnected, his reign demonstrating how someone fundamentally unsuited for power can break under its weight in ways that affect millions. Number 11. King Edward VIII, the king who chose love over everything. King Edward VIII, who ruled for less than a year in 1936 before abdicating, broke under pressure by making a choice that shocked the world, abandoning his throne for a twice-divorced American woman in a decision that represented complete emotional rupture with duty, family, and royal tradition. Born in 1894 as the eldest son of George V, Edward seemed destined for successful kingship. But his fixation on Wallis Simpson revealed a personality that would crack entirely when forced to choose between personal desire and institutional obligation. Contemporary accounts describe Edward's relationship with Wallis as consuming in ways that alarmed those around him. Sources suggest he became emotionally dependent to a degree that went beyond normal attachment. His entire sense of purpose apparently bound up in this one relationship. Historical records show that as pressure mounted from government, church, and family to end the relationship, Edward's response was increasingly frantic determination to keep Wallis regardless of consequences. The abdication crisis of 1936 represented Edward's complete breaking point. When told he could not marry Wallis and remain king, contemporary sources indicate Edward didn't seriously consider compromise. Instead, he chose immediate abdication, demonstrating how completely pressure to choose had shattered his capacity to balance competing obligations. His radio address revealed someone whose emotional needs had overwhelmed every other consideration, stating he could not carry the burden without the woman he loved beside him. His life after abdication demonstrated the costs of his choice. Edward spent decades in exile, never quite finding purpose or contentment. His decision to prioritize personal relationship, leaving him neither fully private nor meaningfully royal. He died in 1972, having gained Wallis, but lost everything else, his abdication representing a form of breaking where pressure to choose between incompatible loyalties produced a rupture so complete that recovery proved impossible. Number 12. Queen Victoria, the widow who disappeared. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, broke under the weight of grief after Prince Albert's death in 1861. Her withdrawal from public life so complete and prolonged that it threatened the monarchy's stability. Born in 1819, Victoria had ruled for over 2 decades with Albert as her essential partner. His sudden death from typhoid fever at age 42, removing the person she depended on so completely that she essentially ceased functioning as a public monarch for years. Contemporary accounts describe Victoria's immediate response as total emotional collapse. She ordered his rooms kept exactly as they were and refused to remove mourning black for the remaining 40 years of her life. But beyond these rituals, sources document something more concerning. Victoria's withdrawal from the ceremonial and public duties that monarchy required. She refused to open parliament, attend public functions, or show herself to her subjects, retreating to Windsor Castle and later to Scotland, where she could avoid responsibilities that now felt unbearable. The political consequences were significant. Her ministers struggled to govern effectively without a visible monarch. Public opinion turned increasingly critical of an absent queen, and Republican sentiment grew as people questioned the value of a monarchy that didn't perform its functions. Historical records show that even her own family became alarmed, attempting to pressure her back into public life with limited success. Her eventual emergence from complete seclusion came gradually and incompletely. Victoria resumed some duties in the 1870s, but never fully returned to the active public role she had played before Albert's death. She died in 1901, having transformed from active monarch to reclusive widow. Her decades of withdrawal demonstrating how grief can break even those born to duty, creating a rupture between personal need and public obligation that time never fully healed. Number 13. Queen Elizabeth I, controlled fury behind the mask. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled England from 1558 to 1603, maintained extraordinary composure under constant pressure for over 4 decades. But contemporary accounts document moments when that control shattered in displays of rage that revealed the enormous strain she carried beneath her carefully crafted public image. Born in 1533, Elizabeth spent her formative years navigating deadly political threats where one wrong step could mean execution, creating a personality that valued control above almost everything. Historical sources describe Elizabeth as someone who understood that showing weakness could be fatal, particularly as a female monarch in an era that questioned women's capacity to rule. She maintained discipline over her emotions in public settings, but court observers documented instances where pressure would accumulate until it exploded in private. Contemporary accounts describe her striking courtiers who displeased her, throwing objects when angered, and unleashing verbal attacks that left recipients shaken. These occurrences weren't frequent, but their rarity made them more notable when they happened. Her treatment of those who threatened her control revealed how pressure affected her beneath the surface. When Mary, Queen of Scots, represented both dynastic threat and personal challenge, Elizabeth's handling showed someone struggling with decisions that kept her awake. Sources suggest she agonized for years over signing Mary's death warrant, her usual decisive nature affected by the implications of executing another queen. This choice creating visible strain that courtiers noted. Her final years saw Elizabeth's control become more brittle. Contemporary observers noted that she seemed increasingly volatile, her temper quicker to trigger. The death of her favourite, the Earl of Essex, whom she had reluctantly ordered executed for treason, appeared to affect her deeply. She died in March 1603 at age 69, having maintained her composure almost to the end, but those close to her recognised that decades of pressure had taken a toll that even her formidable will couldn't entirely contain. Number 14. King William I, ice cold until the north. King William the Conqueror, who seized England in 1066 and ruled until 1087, maintained ruthless control throughout his reign, but his response to Northern English rebellion in 1069 revealed a breaking point where calculated military action crossed into something more extreme. Born around 1028, as an illegitimate son who fought constantly to maintain his Norman duchy, William had learned to channel anger into effective action, but persistent resistance in northern England apparently pushed him beyond his usual cold calculation. Contemporary chronicles describe William's military campaigns as typically methodical and controlled. He conquered England through careful planning and disciplined execution, establishing control through strategic force rather than indiscriminate action. But when northern England rose in rebellion in 1069, supported by Danish forces, sources suggest William's response revealed how accumulated pressure could affect even his iron control. The harrying of the north that followed represented systematic devastation that went beyond military necessity. Historical records document William's forces destroying villages, livestock, crops, and food stores across Yorkshire, with thoroughness that created famine lasting years. Contemporary chroniclers writing decades later described the devastation with notable concern, estimating that thousands died from starvation in the aftermath. Sources suggest this wasn't spontaneous violence, but calculated destruction executed over months. William's usual restraint replaced by determination to ensure northern England would never threaten him again. The scale of the harrying apparently troubled even William in later years. Sources indicate that on his deathbed, he expressed remorse for the devastation he had caused, suggesting awareness that his response had crossed lines even he recognized as excessive. He died in 1087, having secured his conquest, but at costs that historians still debate. His brief loss of control in the north, demonstrating how even the most disciplined can break when pressure accumulates beyond endurance. Number 15. King Edward I, the hammer who never softened. King Edward I, who ruled England from 1272 to 1307, responded to pressure not by breaking visibly, but by becoming progressively harder and more severe. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland revealing how constant military conflict could transform a capable ruler into someone whose methods shocked even his era. Born in 1239, Edward began his reign as a competent administrator and military leader, but decades of warfare apparently hardened him into a figure whose responses to resistance became increasingly extreme. His conquest of Wales demonstrated methodical severity that went beyond military necessity. Contemporary sources document Edward's systematic suppression of Welsh independence, his construction of massive castles designed to permanently intimidate, and his treatment of Welsh leaders that established his reputation as someone who would tolerate no defiance. Historical records suggest these weren't passionate responses, but calculated demonstrations, though the calculation itself revealed how pressure had affected his judgment about appropriate force. His Scottish campaigns intensified these patterns. When William Wallace led Scottish resistance, Edward's eventual capture and execution of him involved extreme measures designed to terrorize others. Sources describe treatment that contemporary observers noted, even in an era accepting of harsh justice. Edward's removal of the Stone of Scone to Westminster similarly demonstrated systematic approach to domination. His death in 1307 came while leading yet another Scottish campaign at age 68. Contemporary accounts describe him demanding to be carried north with his army even as he was dying, unable to abandon warfare that had consumed his final decades. His request that his bones be carried into battle against the Scots revealed how completely military pressure had shaped him, transforming a capable king into a figure defined primarily by relentless conquest that even death couldn't soften. Number 16. King Richard I, the Crusader who abandoned his kingdom. King Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart, ruled England from 1189 to 1199, but spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in his kingdom, his obsession with crusading revealing a breaking from duty so complete that England became merely a source of funding for his military adventures. Born in 1157, Richard demonstrated from earliest adulthood that his passion lay in military glory rather than governance, creating a situation where pressure to fulfill kingly duties was simply ignored in favour of battlefield pursuits. Contemporary chronicles describe Richard's immediate response to inheriting the throne, selling everything possible to fund his crusade. Historical sources document him selling offices, castles, and rights with such enthusiasm that he reportedly joked about selling London itself if he could find a buyer. This wasn't merely raising campaign funds, it revealed how little he valued England, except as a resource for financing what actually mattered to him. His conduct during the Third Crusade showed someone who had found his purpose in warfare. Contemporary accounts from both Christian and Muslim sources describe Richard's military focus and his complete absorption in military operations. When diplomatic considerations required attention, sources suggest he became impatient, viewing anything that wasn't direct combat as unwelcome distraction. His brief return to England after imprisonment in Austria lasted only months before he departed for wars in France, never to return. He spent his final years fighting over continental territories, dying in 1199 at age 41 from an infected arrow wound received while besieging a minor castle. He left England to his brother John, having essentially abandoned his kingdom for a decade in pursuit of military glory, his reign demonstrating how obsession can become a form of breaking, where responsibility is simply cast aside for personal passion. Number 17. King James I, the anxious king's unsteady rule. King James I, who ruled England from 1603 to 1625 after years as King of Scotland, governed under pressures that manifested in emotional volatility and dependency on favourites that undermined his authority. Born in 1566, James experienced a traumatic childhood that included his mother's forced abdication and execution, his father's murder, and years of manipulation by Scottish nobles, creating a personality marked by anxieties that kingship's pressures would intensify rather than resolve. Contemporary accounts describe James as someone whose moods could shift unpredictably, creating an atmosphere at court where officials never quite knew which version of the king they would encounter. Historical sources document his tendency to form intense attachments to male favourites, particularly George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. Sources suggest James's emotional dependency on these favourites affected his judgment, his need for their approval apparently overriding careful political consideration. His response to challenges revealed someone struggling to maintain composure under pressure. When Parliament questioned his policies, or his favourites, contemporary accounts describe James becoming defensive in his responses, his usual scholarly intelligence apparently affected when stress mounted. His writings on kingship emphasized divine right and absolute authority, but sources suggest this theoretical certainty masked deep insecurities about his actual capacity to command respect. His final years saw James increasingly withdraw from active governance, leaving much authority to Buckingham, while he retreated into hunting and scholarly pursuits. He died in March 1625 at age 58, having ruled for over 2 decades, but never quite achieving the security and respect he craved. His reign demonstrating how childhood trauma can create vulnerabilities that even supreme power cannot resolve, leaving a king who broke not catastrophically, but gradually under pressures his personality was never equipped to handle. Number 18. King George II, the volatile Hanoverian. King George II, who ruled from 1727 to 1760, brought to the British throne a temperament marked by explosive rages and family conflicts that created an atmosphere of tension throughout his 33-year reign. Born in 1683 in Hanover, George inherited both a kingdom and a family pattern of bitter father-son relationships. His inability to control his temper, creating situations that undermined his authority and revealed someone constantly struggling with pressures both political and personal. Contemporary accounts describe George's temper as notorious. Court observers documented his tendency to explode into rage over matters both significant and trivial, his reactions creating disruption throughout the palace. Historical sources suggest these outbursts weren't calculated displays, but genuine losses of control, revealing someone whose emotional regulation was affected by accumulated pressures he couldn't manage effectively. His relationship with his eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, replicated the bitter dynamic George had experienced with his own father. Contemporary sources document harsh arguments, public humiliations, and mutual contempt that shocked observers. When Frederick died in 1751, some sources suggest George showed more relief than grief, the pressure of their conflict having apparently affected any paternal feeling that might have existed. His final years saw George's volatile temperament unchanged by age or experience. He died suddenly in October 1760 at age 76. His life demonstrated how someone can function as monarch while essentially breaking repeatedly under pressure. Each outburst a fracture that never quite healed before the next crisis triggered another explosion, creating a reign where competent governance coexisted with ongoing emotional instability that those around him learned to navigate but never quite resolved. Number 19. Prince Albert, the perfectionist who couldn't rest. Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria from their marriage in 1840 until his death in 1861, broke under pressure not through explosion, but through relentless perfectionism and inability to ever feel he had done enough. His compulsive need to prove his worth ultimately contributing to the illness that killed him at age 42. Born in 1819 into German nobility, Albert arrived in England facing a country that viewed him as a foreign interloper, creating pressures to demonstrate value that apparently became internalized into standards he could never quite meet. Contemporary accounts describe Albert's approach to his role as obsessively thorough. He involved himself in every aspect of Victoria's work, reading all governmental papers and working late into the night on projects designed to improve British society. Historical sources suggest this wasn't merely diligence, but compulsive need to justify his position. His concern about being seen as useless, driving him to work schedules that alarmed even those who benefited from his efforts. His approach to parenting revealed similar patterns of rigid control. Sources document Albert creating demanding educational schedules for his children, becoming frustrated when they failed to meet his exacting standards, and showing limited patience for imperfection. Contemporary observers noted that he seemed to view any deviation from his plans as personal failure. The pressure he placed on himself extending to impossible expectations for everyone around him. His final illness came after years of chronic stomach problems that he had ignored while continuing his punishing work schedule. When typhoid fever struck in December 1861, his weakened system couldn't fight the infection. He died on December 14th, having worked himself relentlessly. His breaking under pressure manifested not in dramatic collapse, but in gradual self-destruction, through inability to ever feel he had done enough to earn his place. Number 20. King Edward VII, the prince who waited too long. King Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1910 after spending nearly 60 years as heir to the throne, broke under decades of enforced idleness by indulging in excesses that scandalized Victorian society and revealed someone whose potential had transformed into compulsive pleasure-seeking during his long wait for power. Born in 1841 as Queen Victoria's eldest son, Edward spent his entire adult life preparing for a role his mother refused to let him practice. The pressure of purposeless waiting apparently affecting a capable young man in ways that defined his decades as Prince of Wales. Contemporary accounts describe Edward's lifestyle during these years as marked by constant seeking of pleasure through food, gambling, and numerous affairs. Historical sources suggest this wasn't merely aristocratic indulgence, but something more concerning. A man filling purposeless hours with activities that provided temporary satisfaction, but no lasting fulfillment. His weight increased dramatically, his gambling debts mounted repeatedly, and his romantic entanglements created situations that embarrassed his mother. His breaking manifested as inability to moderate behaviors he recognized as problematic. Sources indicate Edward knew his excesses affected his reputation and disappointed his wife Alexandra, yet he seemed unable to stop, the pattern suggesting someone whose decades of frustrated ambition had created needs that nothing quite satisfied. His involvement in various society controversies revealed how completely he had abandoned attempts at the dignity expected of future kings. When he finally became king at age 59, Edward proved surprisingly capable in his ceremonial and diplomatic roles. His brief reign saw him work effectively at functions Victoria had neglected. He died in May 1910 at age 68, having ruled less than a decade, his life demonstrating how enforced purposelessness can transform potential into compulsion, leaving us to wonder what he might have achieved if given meaningful responsibility before it was too late. Number 21. Queen Henrietta Maria, defiant in the face of collapse. Queen Henrietta Maria, consort to King Charles I from 1625 until his execution in 1649, responded to mounting political crisis not by compromise, but with increasingly defiant actions that contributed to the breakdown leading to civil war. Born in 1609 as a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria arrived in Protestant England facing suspicion that apparently shaped a personality marked by stubborn determination to assert influence regardless of political consequences. Contemporary accounts describe Henrietta Maria's growing political involvement as Charles's position weakened. Historical sources suggest she encouraged his most firm positions, her own Catholic faith and French upbringing making her unable to understand the Protestant concerns driving parliamentary opposition. Sources indicate she viewed compromise as weakness, her advice to Charles apparently reinforcing his own rigid tendencies rather than tempering them, demonstrating how pressure can cause doubling down on failing strategies. Her attempts to raise funds and support for Charles during the Civil War revealed determination that crossed into recklessness. She travelled to the continent seeking military aid, pawned crown jewels to buy weapons, and apparently encouraged Charles toward military solutions, even when his position was deteriorating. Contemporary observers noted that her correspondence often urged him toward harder lines when circumstances demanded flexibility. Her final years in France after Charles's execution saw her living in exile and relative poverty, the defiance that had marked her queenship having contributed to losing everything. She died in 1669 at age 59, Having outlived her husband by 2 decades but never regaining the position she had wielded, her life demonstrating how breaking under pressure through stubborn refusal to adapt can turn difficult situations into outcomes from which recovery becomes impossible. Number 22. King George I, detached and resentful. King George I, who ruled England from 1714 to 1727, broke under the pressure of being thrust into a kingdom he never sought by essentially refusing to fully engage with his role, his emotional distance creating a reign marked more by absence than active governance. Born in 1660 in Hanover, George spent his first 54 years as a German prince with no expectation of the British throne, his sudden inheritance through distant family connections, apparently creating not excitement but burden he approached with visible reluctance. Contemporary accounts describe George's reign as marked by his inability or unwillingness to properly engage with British politics and society. He never learned English despite ruling for 13 years, conducting business through translators and making little effort to understand the country whose king he had become. Historical sources suggest this wasn't merely language difficulty, but deeper emotional resistance to a role he hadn't chosen, his breaking under pressure manifesting as withdrawal rather than active dysfunction. His treatment of his wife, whom he had imprisoned in Germany for alleged adultery years before becoming British king, revealed the coldness that characterized his emotional life. When he became king, he refused to allow her to join him or even acknowledge her existence. Sources suggest George carried grudges that affected his political decisions, his personal feelings influencing matters that should have been handled more objectively. His frequent returns to Hanover, spending months at a time away from Britain, showed where his real interests lay. Contemporary observers noted that he seemed happier in Germany than England, viewing his British kingdom as obligation rather than opportunity. He died in June 1727 while visiting Hanover at age 67, having spent his reign essentially breaking slowly under the weight of unwanted responsibility, his detachment demonstrating how pressure to fulfill roles we never chose can produce not dramatic failure, but quiet refusal to truly engage. Number 23. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Controlled strain beneath the surface. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who served as consort to Queen Elizabeth II from 1952 until his death in 2021, spent nearly 7 decades in a role that required constant self-control and subordination, his rare moments of visible strain revealing the enormous pressure of a position that offered no clear purpose beyond supporting someone else. Born in 1921 into Greek and Danish royalty, Philip had pursued a promising naval career before his marriage to Elizabeth forced him to abandon personal ambitions for a life defined entirely by walking behind his wife. Contemporary accounts describe Philip's adaptation to his role as largely successful, but occasionally punctured by moments where his frustration became visible. His sharp tongue and direct comments, while sometimes refreshing, occasionally revealed someone struggling with constraints that made no allowance for his own abilities. Historical sources suggest that behind his public adjustment lay genuine struggle with a position that gave him status but denied him agency. His creation of the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme and involvement in various causes demonstrated attempts to carve out meaningful purpose within impossible constraints. Sources indicate these projects weren't merely keeping busy, but genuine efforts to create identity separate from being the Queen's husband. His need for autonomous achievement suggesting someone who never fully reconciled himself to a purely supportive role despite maintaining it for decades. His final years saw Philip step back from public duties at age 96, finally able to retreat from a role he had never chosen but had fulfilled with remarkable discipline. He died in April 2021 at age 99, having maintained his composure for nearly 70 years in a position that required constant self-suppression, his life demonstrating how some forms of breaking occur so slowly and so privately that only those paying close attention notice the strain beneath the surface control. Number 24. Prince Harry, the modern royal who walked away. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, born in 1984 as the second son of King Charles III and Princess Diana, broke under institutional pressure by making the unprecedented choice to step back from royal duties entirely. His decision in 2020 to leave the working royal family representing a modern form of breaking, where departure became the only visible option for maintaining well-being. Growing up under intense media scrutiny that only intensified after his mother's death when he was 12, Harry spent his entire life navigating pressures that combined personal trauma with institutional constraints. Contemporary accounts describe Harry's struggles with his role as visible and increasing over time. His military service provided temporary escape, but return to full-time royal duties apparently created pressures he found difficult to manage. Historical observers note that his marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018, while initially appearing positive, intensified conflicts between Harry's desire to protect his wife from media treatment and the institution's expectations for royal family members. His announcement in January 2020 that he and Meghan would step back from senior royal duties surprised his family and the public. Sources suggest this decision reflected accumulation of pressures that had become difficult to sustain, his choice to prioritize his family's well-being over institutional obligation, representing a breaking where traditional royal sacrifice was rejected in favor of personal mental health and autonomy. His subsequent public discussions about his reasons for leaving revealed someone who felt constrained by an institution that offered limited accommodation for individual needs. His life to this point demonstrates how institutional pressure in the modern age can produce breaks that earlier generations might not have chosen, his departure representing recognition that some pressures carry costs that aren't worth enduring regardless of status or obligation, demonstrating how breaking in the 21st century can mean choosing to leave rather than remaining until collapse. And so our journey through 24 royals who broke under pressure comes to a close. From Mary I's religious persecution, driven by decades of humiliation, to Prince Harry's modern decision to walk away entirely, from Henry VI's complete withdrawal into silence to Edward II's fatal emotional fixations, we've witnessed how the weight of crowns can crush even those born to wear them. These stories reveal a truth that transcends centuries and circumstances. Pressure affects everyone, regardless of power or privilege. Some broke suddenly, their composure shattering in moments of crisis that changed history. Others broke gradually, their deterioration so slow that only hindsight reveals the accumulation of strain that eventually proved unbearable. A few broke quietly, their struggles visible only to those closest to them, while others' breakdowns played out on stages where entire nations watched their unraveling. What connects all 24 is the reminder that being royal offered no immunity from human limits. The pressures they faced, whether political, personal, or institutional, found the cracks in even the most carefully constructed facades. Their breaking points demonstrate that everyone has limits, that even supreme power cannot protect against the weight of impossible expectations, and that sometimes the cost of maintaining appearances becomes too high to bear. If you found these stories revealing, please subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the hidden lives of history's most powerful figures. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll reflect that understanding how even royals broke under pressure reminds us to be gentler with ourselves and others when the weight becomes too much. Thank you for listening. Rest well, and remember that recognizing our limits isn't weakness, but wisdom. Good night.